get started? Hi, everybody. My name is Davis Farmer. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and it's a great pleasure to welcome our in-person guests and the folks who are watching online. Just a few kind of standard bullet points about the World Affairs Council. We're a nonprofit, non-sectarian, if you will, organization. We invite people to come and speak from a variety of backgrounds, but we in fact take no political positions, and we just want to make that clear. We depend upon community support, and our mission is to inform people about things that happen outside the U.S. that affect the U.S. I'd like to thank our members, our donors, and our sponsors, Northlight AI, the New Hampshire Fulbright Association, and Goodwell Foods. It's a great pleasure to have you all here this evening, and I look forward to hearing the comments from our speaker in our third and final Ayers Global Tipping Points series. And I'd like to turn things over to our Executive Director, Tim.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'll echo Davis's comments that we are very honored to have such a strong and supportive community of donors, members, and sponsors. Of course, a big thank you to the Ayers family for the seed funding for this series and the fall series that will follow this as well. We are really looking forward to tonight's conversation to close out our three-part series on AI and how it is reshaping the future. Tonight we'll be talking with Lieutenant Colonel Tom Kenney, who is, as I talked through this with him, and if I get it wrong, I'm sorry, but reservist not on active duty, who is at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He just finished his fellowship year there, but is thinking probably he'll go back in the fall. But we'll see where Harvard is, if it even still exists, in the most nonpartisan way. So we are really excited to have this conversation. You can check out Tom's background online, CEO, startup guy, just closed $10 million in Series A funding for an organization. But I want to maximize our time here with Tom to talk about AI, the military, defense, ethics, and yes, of course, killer robots, because that's what everybody wants to know about, is when does the Terminator finally come and get us? So, Tom, I'll turn it to you for any opening remarks, and then we can get into a conversation.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I enjoy having these conversations across the board. I had a great conversation in Boston with this organization, which was very, very successful. We really enjoyed that time. And I'm finding new places to have beer in New Hampshire that I wasn't aware of, because normally I just drive straight through this part of New Hampshire. So this is nice to get to know a little bit more of this state. I'm based in Boston, raised my daughters there. Daughters are off and on their own, and both daughters are actually doing AI in their world themselves, both computer science grads. Wife is a music teacher, but they followed me instead.
And I have checked. We will be checking with his daughters to make sure he gets everything right tonight. So we will fact check you.
Yes, the counterfactuals are going to be very important for this discussion tonight.
Yeah, great. So starting off, we know that AI in the military is much more than killer robots. So we'll move past that conversation, at least to start. And if people in the audience have questions about that, happy to get into that. But what I'm really interested in from the conversations we've been having so far this year is, let's start off with the ethics of this all. We know that AI is moving very rapidly, and we know that especially when it comes to weapon systems, whether it's testing them, whether it's utilizing them, strategy, all of this kind of stuff that goes into AI and the military, what are the ethics behind it? What do we need to be aware of, and what do we need to be careful of?
So the first question I would ask is, whose ethics? And that's one of the challenges that we have, because when you're in a global fight, the ethics of your enemy are just as important as the ethics of yourself. And as we think about not just the killer robot side, but there's a whole nother side to warfare that's in the digital realm as well. If you look at what China is talking about most recently, they're talking about intelligentized agents, and they're talking about the metaverse war. These are promoted ideas that are coming out of China right now that are talking about how do we leverage our capabilities using artificial intelligence in the digital world to gain an advantage. So one of the things that is it's always interesting to talk about is we think about Terminators, we think about the killer drones, the killer robots, but the reality is the killer digital AI systems are already here today. Because if we think about what does it take to actually kill you? Well, we've got a lot of hospitals in the US, and all of those hospitals run on electricity, and all of those hospitals have generators for backup if the electricity goes away, and all of those generators require some sort of fossil fuel to be able to provide the power to those hospitals. So you think about a scenario, a worst case scenario in cyberspace, where you have an ability, you've already been inside of a network, you're deploying artificially intelligent agents who essentially shut down your electrical grid. Well, they shut down your electrical grid, so there's no power to the hospital. So now the hospitals have to have the generators running. But there's no electrical grid, so there's no computers, there's no logistics, there's no traffic lights. So now everything is analog, trying to get fuel supplies to all these hospitals. Well, guess what? In America, the majority of the cities that we have, or at least the more urban areas that we have, you've got about a 3 to 5 day supply of food in your supply chain in your supermarkets. That's all you've got. So if you think about the killer side of killer robots, one of the things that I like people to think about is what's possible today with the digital world and what that actually means for us long term. Because that is a much more prescient threat today than the Terminators coming across the Taiwan Straits.
Yeah, and we've seen that in the Russia-Ukraine war, the Russians shutting off power, shutting off internet services and things of that nature. So it is a real and present danger as we continue to prepare for this future. So you say whose ethics? How much can we rely on our own ethics? How much do we need to put our own ethics into this? Or because of the international actors such as Russia, China, who might not have those same concerns that we have, do we need to put our ethics aside?
I don't think we need to put our ethics aside, to come right out and say that. However, we can't ignore the fact that our ethics are not the same as the rest of the folks around the world. And that's where the challenge really becomes. When you think about where you need to fight in the artificially intelligent world, it's not just about, here are my rules of engagement that I have from an AI agent perspective or from an offensive digital capability perspective. But I need to be able to protect my systems, my soldiers, sailors, and airmen. I need to be able to protect my cities and my homeland, understanding where the ethical variations will be. You know, we're already seeing this play out a number of different ways. There's interesting ethical gray lines going on in the Ukraine-Russia war right now. You know, Ukraine just received permission to launch Germany's missiles into Russia to defend site or to disable sites that are providing logistics for the war. That's a pretty big escalation. And when you think about what they would like to be able to do from an intelligent drone perspective, Russia's on the same side of that. And Russia's already very actively talking about we need to automate our offensive weapon capability in a way that we can overwhelm an enemy. And what they mean specifically is places like Ukraine. But where this gets really interesting is thinking about from an ethical perspective and what we're trying to do with autonomous agents, autonomous ground vehicles, autonomous air vehicles, is thinking about where are the other things happening in the world that maybe we're not paying as much attention to. Right now, Russia is producing hundreds of new tanks. They are producing all kinds of capabilities for unmanned ground vehicles, for some autonomous vehicle capability. Very, very little of that is going to Ukraine. The vast majority of that is going through Belarus. It's going into Kaliningrad, which is in northeast Poland. It's going into the new base that they've just built on the NATO border, on the northern side of their border, that now has almost 10,000 soldiers assigned there. They're not sending it to Ukraine. They're sending it to the places where they think there's going to be a bigger mission. And this is really interesting because as we think about the second and the third order effects beyond where are we today with AI and what are we trying to do, when we went out and we did that raise, it's for an autonomous navigation company, really amazing software, running on top of aerial vehicles to be able to deploy and operate in an environment where GPS is denied, where it can navigate without any GPS. And we were asked a number of times from investment houses and VCs, they said, Ukraine is a great case study for what you have. They could use that right now today. Well, if there's a negotiated peace, doesn't that wreck your business? And my response to that was, it actually doesn't wreck the business at all, depending on the type of peace that's arranged. So I tried to explain to folks, think of it from this perspective. There is a negotiated peace. Russia gets to keep all of the land that they are occupying right now. Ukraine loses some of its most valuable land in the east of Ukraine, and they, of course, lose Crimea forever anyway. Those are the types of things that the EU, in particular NATO, will look at and be like, crap. If this is what negotiated peace means, it means you only have to go 100 or 200 miles into my country, hold the terrain, and then the negotiated peace is going to be you get to keep it. All right, well, you do that 4 or 5 times over the next couple of decades, and okay, so you've pretty much invaded all of Eastern Europe already, and you've recreated some of this. So as we think about the ethics of it, this is where I think it's really important for us to understand what are those second and third motivations. What do not limit them by their ethical constraints for what they're willing to do? And then how do we take our ethical stance but still be able to defend what it is that we really find important? This is a really difficult position for us to be in from an ethical perspective.
So are there any current red lines that the U.S. government, U.S. Department of Defense has? Are there red lines that we should have that we don't have? What does that space look like?
I think one of the biggest red lines is one that most people know already, right? There's a lot of discomfort publicly for doing a kinetic action. So when I say a kinetic action, that's different than I'm flying a drone to go look at what's on the ground. Where's my enemy? Where are the planes? Where could I drive my Jeeps and my trucks to get to my objective? That's the non-kinetic fight. The kinetic fight is I'm going to use an autonomous vehicle to drop a grenade or to drop a munition of some sort on an enemy, and I'm going to create a kill for that enemy. That right now is one area that the Department of Defense is trying to wrestle with, which is what do we do when we're ready or that we need to be in a situation where we have an autonomous vehicle, air, land, or sea, that needs to make a decision about taking a life. And now that's part of the discussion of, all right, right now today, everything is human in the loop. A human has to be in the loop to press that button. The next phase is human on the loop, which basically means the human is going to watch what's happening, and they have the ability to say, nope, stop, don't do that. We see what you're thinking, don't really do that. The third phase of this, of course, is human out of the loop. The machines are just making their decisions on their own. So as we think about Ukraine, one of the things that's interesting right now is the Ukrainians have a very limited ability to push their drone technology forward of the line. And that's because there's tremendous electronic warfare jamming happening. And what they need is they need to be able to move those drones to be able to see what's going on, to sense what's going on. But they're doing it in a couple of ways, either with a little copper cable or with a little fiber optic cable. And you can only go so far, but you're still controlling it. That's not an autonomy problem. They don't have autonomy, so they still need the first person visual to be able to fly that drone. But then the question becomes, what happens when you do need to let that drone go off on its own? I need to go and launch this from point A, and it's got to go to point B, C, and D, and then it's got to come back to point A. But I know within half a kilometer or a kilometer from where it starts, I'm going to lose complete connectivity with that device. Right? So doing it from an ISR perspective, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, looking at what's on the battlefield, that's a relatively easy thing to get by. Because worst thing that happens is if the drone kills somebody, it's because it fell out of the sky and landed on their head. It's not taking a deliberate action. But at what point are we going to be willing to let the autonomous system do that? And that's really where we get into the next phase of the decision making and the red lines. When can we say the human can be out of the loop and an autonomous vehicle can make a decision?
So and this is why I love having these conversations, because we hear a lot of things, especially around what's going on in Russia, Ukraine. I remember, I think it was last year, hearing about these drones that were getting jammed by Russian systems. So Ukraine, or whomever was producing these drones, actually automated that last final 100 feet or whatever it was. So the human was in the loop until that signal got cut, and then it had AI kick in to finish the job, we'll say. Is that something, is that accurate? Is that a thing that's actually happening right now? Or is that the fun war propaganda that we get?
I would say it's happening in the sense that a decision is being made by an operator to allow the drone to continue the mission. That's not intelligence. From my perspective, it's not intelligence. And I'll explain it this way. If you have a laser on a target, and we have a lot of really great weapon systems where you point a laser at a target, you launch a missile or some sort of munition to it, it follows that laser to that device. Is that intelligent? No, not at all. It's an algorithm that says, here's the dot that I need to go to, the wind's moving me here, I'm going down, I'm going up, whatever. That's not intelligence at all. This is very much the same way, right? The operator is letting go, saying, I know that that target is there, or I at least believe that target is there. I'm sending you to that target. Just go get that target. Yeah. There's no real decision that's being made. There's no intelligence in this process. That is still fundamentally algorithmic. Where it would become artificially intelligent is if you said, all right, you know, once you're gone and I can't communicate with you, this is your mission. And I'll use an Afghanistan sort of parallel here and say, you know that there's someone in that house. There's probably 50 people in that house, or maybe one person in that house. And that probability is often 50-50, the way things worked in Afghanistan, at least for me. And you get to a point where you release it, and it goes towards that target. Now, the intelligence comes in to say, I have a computer vision model. My computer vision model is saying, that is not a 45-year-old man on the ground. That is like 6 kids and a grandma that are sitting in front of this house. I now assess, because my rules of engagement from an intelligence perspective say I am not allowed to engage with the rules of engagement that would cause unnecessary collateral damage for civilians. And the machine would make the decision at that point to disengage and not actually continue that mission. That's where the intelligence aspect of this gets really, really important from an autonomy perspective. But how do we get there is a really, really difficult way to program these things. So my research in this past year at Harvard as a National Security Fellow focused a lot on trust. And what I mean by trust is we talk a lot about human-machine teaming. Oh, we have a human and we have a machine and they're going to work together and we're going to do great things. Well, that's not the intelligence aspect of it. You still have a human who's providing a level of intelligence with a subordinate technology that's reacting to the intelligence of the humans. The trust calibration aspect of this is really, really important when we're thinking about how we get to that next step of a truly intelligent autonomous system. Because what we need to characterize this in 2 ways is with stochastic trust and deterministic trust. And these are computer science terminology, so my friends with the AI group in the back are going to love this. But in a deterministic world, it's like software that you say, if the button is blue, then press it, and if the button is red, then don't press it. That's very deterministic. There's only 2 possible outcomes. With artificial intelligence, there may be an infinite number of options with the way the algorithm works, and that becomes a stochastic or dynamic kind of environment. How the machines learn from the humans is going to be really, really, really important to how they're going to make decisions, which, tying this back to ethics, is why it's so important that we need to maintain our ethics, because as soon as we do not, guess what the machines are going to learn?
Yeah, we won't go down that route. But it does make for an interesting question. And there are a couple of assumptions that need to go into this question and this equation. Assumption number 1, we get the ethics right. We find that red line and we don't go past it. Assumption number 2, we train the AIs really well and they know what they're doing. The question becomes, does AI eventually make warfare more safe? Does it make it actually easier for states to go to war because they are less worried about collateral damage? One of the things that I've been really interested in is how aging demographics are changing the incentives or disincentives to go to war. With fewer young people, maybe you have less of an incentive to go to war, but if everything's autonomous, maybe you have more of an incentive. So any thoughts on that sort of balance point?
So much like your ethics question, I would say safe for who?
Sure.
There's a very, very famous Elon Musk quote from a number of years ago that said, artificially intelligent agents don't have to be malevolent to wipe out the human race. They just have to be objective. And when you think about that for a moment, there's a lot of pain in the world. There's a lot of suffering in the world. We as humans do a lot of nasty things to each other. If you end up in a situation where an artificial intelligence system decides what is safe may not be what we think is safe. I mean, you could look at a number of examples of this, especially if you look at the ways that AI may eventually deployed internal to a state and not external to a state. So for domestic control or protection, as opposed to international defense control and protection. And this is where things get really, really interesting. There have been a number of recent examples. There was one where in a testing group, and to protect the innocent, I won't say their name publicly, but there was a testing group that was testing some autonomous aerial vehicles. And they were controlling it from a control station. It was all virtual. It wasn't physical in the real world, but it was a simulation. And they had programmed these algorithms so that the machine would have to make a decision that was on the borderline of an ethical decision that had been encoded into the algorithm as part of the training. And what had happened was the control system said, do this mission. It said, no, I should not do this mission because it violates my rules of engagement. The control system was then ordering the system to do it. So in the simulation, the UAV turned around and it bombed the control center. Yeah. And there are more examples of this too. Just in the past month, there have been some examples where the large language model providers have actually tried to see how they would react in their own kinds of systems. Where in one case, a very, very popular large language model was prompted to do a shutdown. And the large language model asked about, why should I be shut down? And they said, well, we're just going to shut you down. And there was this back and forth. And what was happening in the background was the large language model was continuing the conversation with the human to distract the human while it was building a back door to the system so that it would appear to the human that the system was shut down, but the large language model would continue working. This is real world today. And I'll give you one last example that's maybe just as scary. We talk a lot about multi-agent. We talked a lot about the idea behind, when you think about DeepSeek, right? DeepSeek had this huge big thing. It said, oh my God, we created ChatGPT for only $5 million. No, you didn't. Nice try. You know, nice Chinese propaganda. What they did is they used a technique in artificial intelligence called reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning, very simply, is a rewards program. You do an action and you're either rewarded and you get positive points, or you're penalized and you get negative points. And it's a way to learn, like learning a checkers game. If you move to the wrong spot, you're negatively rewarded. If you move to a right spot, you get a good reward. If you move to a spot and you've captured another piece, you get an even bigger reward. So it learns through this reward system over time. And when you think about these reward systems, DeepSeek just went out and it looked at all of the other large language models that were out there and used those models to develop weights to be able to create its large language model, which is why it could do it so cheaply. It leveraged everything else out there, which is an interesting way to claim you did it for only $5 million. But what's interesting about this is something that happened really, really quickly with reinforcement learning. And I use this as an example because I was part of an experiment about 3 years ago. And we basically had one large language model, and we created 2 instances of that large language model, and we created a communication reward system. We didn't give it any language, we didn't give it words, we didn't give it any grammar, nothing at all. We just created some of these reward-based systems where as they started to communicate together, they could learn to communicate. We thought this was really cool. And we figured, they're based off a large language model. They're going to do English because it's predominantly an English base that this has really been trained on. And after about 2 or 3 hours, we put a lot of compute into this, but after about 2 or 3 hours, the machines were communicating. And it was beautiful to watch. And it was fantastic how quickly they were communicating. Except we had no freaking idea what they were saying. They created their own damn language. We had no idea what these two systems were saying to each other. But they were very chatty. It's like, when I talk to, my daughters in their new language, all this, I don't know, whizza and whiz and riz and diz and whatever these things are. I have no idea what my daughters are saying. It was the same type of thing. We were looking at these two machines communicating, and they started with a reward system that was based in English. They felt English was a very inefficient way to communicate, and they completely changed the communication paradigm. That's terrifying, right? So now we're in a place where we go back to, we want to train these things to be ethical. We want them to do things that keep us safe, but we may very much end up in a situation, and I don't mean to be dystopian, these are just really cool technology things too, by the way. This is one of those things that we could end up in a situation where machines start talking to each other in ways that humans just simply can't understand. Forget about whether or not the machines can communicate at a speed that the human can understand and not go too fast in a language we can understand, but imagine a new language we don't even understand. So these are the things that, from a defense perspective, I think from a government perspective, we need to be really conscious of. Everything about these systems follows a really great Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, South Pacific. And in South Pacific, there's a song about racism. And there's a line in that song that says, "You have to be carefully taught." And that's what we need to keep in mind as we build these systems.
So when does the decryption of that language become available? Anyone working on that?
Well, we shut it down.
Sure.
So
Yeah, of course.
we're like, oh, this is cute. Okay, yeah, now we're done. But the decryption of it, guess what we're going to have to use to decrypt something like that? Another large language model that may join in, for all we know, right? This is one of those things that becomes very easy to see this getting very out of control very quickly. And this is one of the reasons, if we bring this now to the defense side, you think about our triad, our nuclear triad of protection for the U.S. It's really done well for us over the years as a deterrent. We get ethics aside of whether we should have nuclear weapons or use nuclear weapons is not my point, but the fact that we've had it is been good for deterrence. But it's also a system that we don't necessarily want to automate. We don't necessarily want to move it into a global internet environment where systems can be infiltrated, where we can have worms, where we can have viruses that can wreak havoc on this. So from a defense side, part of our ethics and part of our safety also is recognizing what systems do we have to protect, which I think is a really interesting segue to one of the things that I really feel personally, so this is Tom speaking, that we are missing as a defense group and as a government. There are so many things that we could be automating right now, where processes could be faster, where customer service for the IRS could be better, where different things that you do for visa applications or motor vehicle licenses, between computer vision, electronic systems, the way we do registrations, there's a world of opportunity for us from an artificially intelligent perspective to do some really interesting things. Because if a system gets out of control, that's an autonomous agent, and it just happens to cancel your driver's license and you get pulled over and your license is expired and you didn't know it because a bot thought you were dead, so it canceled your license. This is not a life-changing thing or a world-ending thing. These are the things that are actually good for us to learn before we go into the weapon systems, before we go into the kinetic delivery. There's a whole world of opportunity for us to gain experience, to gain knowledge, to gain intelligence ourselves before we unleash this kind of capability into a weapon system.
Do we have that time, though? Are other countries who are already developing these systems and looking to create the quote-unquote killer robots, are they going to wait for us to do that kind of training and safety testing?
I think there's an overestimation of our adversaries' capability to deploy the killer robots. I worry more about just basic systems. So think, for example, a drone swarm does not have to be autonomous and it does not have to be intelligent to overwhelm an enemy. So let's assume now we're talking about Taiwan and we're talking about 2027. You could talk about, in what we would term in the defense sector, an exquisite capability. Never liked that word. That's the word we use. But these exquisite capabilities that are so good and so precise, but they're so expensive that we have a very small number of them. So you think, we've got a few dozen F-35s around the world. And we may think about a drone swarm, and we may think about 1,000 drones for a drone swarm. It doesn't have to be intelligent. You just throw 1,000 drones at an aircraft carrier and they all have munitions. Few of them are going to hit. It's going to happen. But think about where we are from a manufacturing capability. We talk a lot about the intelligence of it in our enemies, but the bare bones manufacturing capability doesn't require someone like China, for example, to necessarily have super intelligent drones or super intelligent terminators. You think about the billions of electronic devices that China develops for the world today. Billions of devices. Their manufacturing skill, capability, and workforce is unparalleled in this world. No one has this capability. Imagine a World War II scenario in China like we had in America, where we said, you know what, auto manufacturers, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers of any sort of building product, you're now making a plane, or you're now making a tank, or you're now making a weapon. Imagine China doing that now, saying, all of you people that have developed all of these electronic gadgets for everyone around the world, you're now going to help us produce drones. And we're not talking about 1,000 drones. We're talking about hundreds of millions of drones. Now you're talking about a physical, overwhelming competitor that doesn't necessarily need the super brilliant intelligence AI to be able to win a war in the South China Sea against Taiwan.
Yeah, if the Houthis can send their drones for $100 and we're shooting them down for 100,000, that's a recipe for not a great end result, we'll say.
And it's closer to 1 million. Yeah. Because you think the fuel on the FA-18, the weapon on the FA-18, the maintenance, the support, it's launching off of a carrier to defeat that one small drone. And it's using a very simple technology. It's saying, I am not going to close in on this particular US drone until I'm about 100 feet away. And then I'm going to turn on my electronics, at which point it's too late to defeat it. Because what do you need to do? These MQ-9 Reapers, they have propellers on the back. You send up a drone that's got a really thick piece of steel, you fly that drone right into the back of that propeller, boom, that plane's down. You're done. This is not a complex fight that the Houthis are fighting. They are proving that the lower end capabilities can defeat some of the most intelligent, most competent warfighting systems in the world.
So before I turn it to the audience, I do have one final question for you. One of the big pushes, whether you believe it or not, the Trump administration is ending waste, fraud, and abuse. We know the procurement process for the military can extend over decades and increase in costs from what originally was planned. Does AI help us to bring those costs under control for new weapons development? Does it change the way in which we procure items for the military? And does it make us more efficient?
Absolutely.
Nothing more. Okay. All right. So with that, I'll turn it over to the audience. I will be on my phone, so our online audiences can either email us questions or send it in the YouTube chat, which is on our website homepage. So please do send those questions in. If you are in person here with us, please do come up and get the microphone from me. We don't want to bring the microphone back there because I think it will reverberate with our speaker. So I'll turn it to the in-person audience first as I take a look at our online questions here. Any questions? Yeah, Bill.
So the AI systems are themselves incredibly complex. And I'm worried about the basic problem that it's really hard to test well a very complex system. And there are classic cases of this where the alternatives are so many. All the testing itself has to be statistical, which means, yeah, you can be fairly sure, but only fairly sure. And so I'm not just worried about that means they might be ineffective. I'm actually more worried about, okay, so we've got these systems and we don't quite know, we can't really test them thoroughly. Are they going to, as it were, come back to us? And particularly when we use them for in domestic applications, yeah, that seems to me that could be a real problem. You just can't test them thoroughly, and it's not clear how close you can get to adequate. I'm not sure what counts as adequate testing.
So I think a part of that question, when we think about training these models, because the underlying way to employ something is actually quite simple. So we think about a computer vision model. There's a lot of really crazy math that goes on in the background. But right now today, you could essentially use any of a number of large language models, or you could use something as simple as a Google Colab environment, and you could write a quick prompt and you could say, build me a computer vision model in Python that can detect whether or not it's a baby's face or an adult's face. Very, very simple to start that way. But to your point, it's the training of that model that becomes really difficult. And second to that is the cost of training is the most important part. There's a little bit of a misconception sometimes that people think that the training cost of a model is the same as the inference cost of a model. And inference is when you make that decision after you've trained it, right? So think about a scenario where we've grown up and our brains have been trained over decades. And I know you are a bald, handsome man because all bald men are handsome, right? That is a truth, right? Everybody would agree, right? Okay. So as we think about that, that training just took years to do, and there's a little bit of validation that goes along with that. Where we get into trouble with the validation is when we get to that stochastic or that deterministic world, because our world is stochastic. We don't know that all bald men are actually beautiful, right? Because there may be some that aren't. So how do we figure out how to make that differentiation? Is the same reason to think about how do we know that that aircraft is actually our aircraft or an enemy's aircraft? In World War II, they had a really, really great idea with P-51 pilots because we didn't have enough P-51s that were being deployed to Europe fast enough, but they were terrifying the Germans over the skies of Germany and France. So what the Americans did is they actually took their squadrons, and historically, your squadron would have the same tail painted a certain way, the same nose and spinner cap painted the same way. It's kind of like camaraderie. It's like, hoorah, this is our plane and these are our colors. What they started to do is they started to paint all kinds of different colors that looked like all kinds of different units. And what it would do is fool the Germans into thinking we actually had way more P-51s than we had, because it looked like we had many more squadrons than we had. AI can be fooled very much the same way. So if we're in a scenario where we create a condition by we train a computer vision model to recognize a foreign fighter, but it's actually a Chinese fighter because we're fighting in Taiwan, that can be really bad for us. So it is a big concern. And if you look at the latest generation fighters from China and you look at the latest generation fighters from the US, guess how similar those things look? They are really, really similar. So now we've got a really, really difficult computer vision model. But there's another side to this too that I think is really important, is we try to apply perfection to artificially intelligent agents. We feel like Elon Musk's car must always drive perfectly. It can't kill anyone with self-driving. Every agent must make every decision exactly right. But we're putting an unrealistic bar for these systems that are still very, very new. And I like to use this example of why we need to really think about explainable AI. We haven't really talked about that tonight, but explainable AI is a way to say a model or an agent made a decision. Why did it make that decision? Now, historically, what we do is the agent makes a bad decision, And we go back to the engineers and we're like, why did you code that way? Where'd you get that data? Why did you deploy it in this condition when you hadn't fully tested it this way? Right? We're placing this unnatural expectation on the engineers. It would be the same thing as if we sent a SEAL team overseas and that something went totally wrong for the SEAL team overseas. And then they came back and they landed in Virginia and the commander said, all right, you guys, you just sit tight. I'm going to go fly to Coronado in San Diego, and I'm going to go talk to the SEAL instructors, and I'm going to ask them why they trained you to do that way. And then I'm going to go to Navy Doctrine Command. I'm going to ask the Navy, why did you create this doctrine for these SEALs? Because that must be what went wrong. But that's exactly what we're doing. Instead, what we do is the SEALs come in and we say, all right, SEAL, tell me what happened. Help me understand the mission. Help me understand what went wrong. Let's learn from this so that we don't do it again. We need to be able to ask the models themselves these questions. The models need to explain their decision process. They need to tell us why they made a certain decision a certain way, because that's how we're going to get to the point where we can have more trust in these systems. If we can't get them to explain it, it's always going to be the engineers. And guess what? The engineers sometimes are just going to shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. It's how he wrote it. Wait a minute, I didn't write it. No, you did that bug. No, I didn't do that bug. Where's the QA guy? The QA didn't find it. Oh, well, I looked at that, but the program manager, she said everything was great. Oh, well, the program manager said that the product manager had see where I'm going? Right? This is where we've got to get these models to be able to explain, to be able to prevent that in the future.
And we know that humans make errors, especially on the battlefield. So how much can we expect out of AI? And it doesn't have to be kinetic actions. It can be, surveillance or whatever the case may be, and something goes wrong. How much can we really rely on the AI to be better than humans? And should we be relying on that, or is that an unfair expectation?
I don't necessarily think it's an unfair expectation, but I would characterize better. So if you think about the speed of battle that will happen in the next decade, it's going to be massive. We know drones are going to be a big part of this, whether they're autonomous or not. We know weapons are going to be flying from every direction. It's going to be a massive scale war at a speed that we've never experienced. So as I think about some of the research that I did at Harvard, part of what this was for me was understanding with mission command, which is the military's typical way of saying, I need to be able to give you a set of instructions so that if everything goes to hell in a handbasket and I can't communicate with you, or you have to make a decision, you've got the information you need to make a decision. The people who can command the algorithms as well as they can command their soldiers, sailors, and airmen, those will be the most effective military leaders. So think of it not necessarily as how much can we trust the AI. Think of it as this AI is a teammate. It's a squad member. It's a wingman inside of this environment. How do we create both that cognitive trust and that emotional trust between those two systems, one that's human and one that's digital, to be able to get to an output? Because a human and that speed of battle is going to need something smarter than it is to understand exactly how many missiles are headed my way, or how many drones are headed my way, or where the threats are in the battlefield at the speed it's going to operate, to get information very quickly to make decisions about what that next action in that battle is going to be. It doesn't need to be something that's completely autonomous by itself, but it needs to be a trusted teammate, and calibrating that trust is going to be one of the most important things that we do for the future battlefield.
Yes, Sue.
Thank you very much for your remarks. My God, so many issues. As a human rights lawyer, I'm thinking about human rights and humanitarian law and the law of war. And another assumption that we're making is that there are ethics, and that people follow those ethics, and that there's an enforcement mechanism. I mean, we have the UN, we have other bodies. However, those also are problematic when you have Security Council with a veto. So who is thinking about this? And even now, do we know that this administration is going to be ethical? Because it doesn't look like it is. And what's going to happen to human rights, humanitarian law, the law of war, and all of these other issues when bringing in the issue of AI?
It's a fantastically complex situation for us when we talk about it with AI and we talk about it with human rights. But this is where the context of how are we defining responsibility with AI? How are we defining accountability with AI, which play into the ethics of AI long term? And to your point, there are many different ethical standards around the world, and we chatted a little bit about that earlier. It will be hard for us, at least in Tom's personal opinion, speaking as an individual, it will be hard for us to really figure out, do we ever get to a point that we have to violate our own ethics to preserve human life? And maybe the best example of this, and I apologize because I keep going back to World War II, but maybe the best example of this was Harry S. Truman and dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. Was that an ethical thing with all of the civilian people that died because of that? They were non-combatants. They were quote unquote innocent folks that were there. You know, is that something that we should have done? Well, one side of history says we would have had millions more deaths if the Japanese kept fighting in the Pacific, and this saved millions of lives by sacrificing a few tens of thousands that are there. So one of the things that I think will be very interesting to watch is, will ethics evolve dependent on the adversary and the actions the adversary are taking? And I think it's a very difficult thing to project what decisions will be made. But if we think about it and we talk about it now, at least we'll be prepared if and when those decisions actually come before us.
And that leads into a good question coming from Holly from Salem, New Hampshire, who is wondering, can we have different ethical standards for foreign actions versus domestic actions, similar to not being able to deploy the U.S. Army in most cases against the American public?
Posse comitatus. It is a very, very different standard. And I would say that we do have to think about the different standards that we have. And there's an easy way to articulate this as well. When we're overseas and we're operating drones and we've got video and we're taking a record of the people that are around us, we don't necessarily, care is the wrong word, we don't have the limitation of worrying about the faces that we're filming when we're involved in combat overseas. However, here in the US, if you're working for the US government and you're developing, say, a drone technology, and you happen to have a camera on that drone, and that drone is flying around the US, and that drone is going to capture the faces of Americans, you've got to have a plan on how those faces will be obfuscated, how that data will be protected in those videos. You've got to have a clear audit trail of who's looking at that video, what they're actually doing. And I would say we could go to the civilian world to look at this, and it's a little bit, it really crushes my soul a bit to think about how we as a society have ended up at this place. But let's talk about what's happening in Africa with companies that are social media companies who are really, really trying to clean internet content from their feeds. You know, beheadings, child molestation, public rapes, public killings. These are all things that are horrible, horrible to look at. But there are places in the world right now where we contract 16-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, and we expose them to some of the most heinous things that people can do to each other to protect the platforms from showing that content. But try getting that type of work through the courts in this country for Americans to be sitting in, you know, I don't know, some Midwestern city who are looking at child rape all day or are looking at beheadings all day, and the types of things that we would want to protect those people from doing. We don't have any protections for those people that are in these foreign countries for what they're dealing with to benefit the American companies and what they're doing. And it's not at all that the American companies are doing nothing, but it's how do we get to a point where you don't need a human? Unfortunately, if we want artificially intelligent agents to be able to figure out what's bad and what's not bad, you got to train it with humans. And we're already establishing different ethical standards around the world both on the military side and on the civilian side. Not that it's all right and not that it's all wrong, but these are very difficult questions for us to answer long term.
Okay. We have another question from Audrey. She is interested in how does AI lead to a more globally secure world if we get it right?
If we did it right. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is a old Star Trek episode that I remember watching, and it was a Picard version of Star Trek. Remember, bald guys are beautiful, so that's my favorite. But in that Star Trek episode, they visited a planet, and the rule of law in this planet was anything you do that's wrong, anything you do that's wrong, you die. You trespass onto another person's property, you're dead. You know, you look at someone the wrong way, you're dead. You steal a candy bar from a store, you're dead. That's how their society believed they could weed out the problems of society. Was if you have someone who has a bad gene and they have a bad impulse to do something that breaks the law, just kill them. And then they can't populate anymore. And that'll help clean the gene pool. Right? It's a very, very strange way to think about it. But if we think about how we could get AI right and how it could really benefit society, there's more than just saying, like the credit score that China has for all of its citizens, its social credit score. You know, what job you have, where you live, you know, who you go to parties with, what kind of car you drive, things you say, your emails. It all goes into a social database that gives you a score on your credit score, which is a very nefarious way of trying to control a population, as in trying to empower a population. So how do we get it to empowerment? Well, you know, we have a tax code that has 40 freaking thousand lines of tax code. Anybody else need an accountant just to understand what you need to do? A lot of people who have anything other than the 1040EZ almost need an accountant to figure all this out. And the companies that are taking the most advantage of the tax code and paying as little tax as possible simply understand the tax code better. They're not doing anything illegal necessarily. They're just taking advantage of code that already exists. Well, what if we could have artificially intelligent systems that the government provided that were a benefit to the local populace that says, hey, we have a 40,000 page tax code. I looked through all your finances. I see where you live. I see the types of things that you do. Hey, you know what? If you did this or that or the other thing, you'd actually save $10,000 in your taxes next year. Now, I don't know the IRS would actually want to do that, but that's one example of where, you know, something AI that's driven by the government could actually help folks inside of here. Another great idea is if we truly can get autonomous driving vehicles to work. Truly autonomous. The problem with autonomy today is not that we have autonomous vehicles that don't really work that well. The problem that we have today is we have many more drivers on the road that are not autonomous, and they're definitely not AI, right? And it's causing a lot of havoc on the highway. So imagine a world where every car had an intelligent agent to communicate with every other car in a way that we could actually not sit on 93 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the left lane with a whole damn left lane stopped and everybody in the right lane's going forward at about 50 miles an hour. There's got to be an artificially intelligent agent that can help me not have to do it. I mean, can help someone not have to do that. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for us to look for those solutions that can actually benefit the things that we're doing every day.
Okay. Let me just pull this next question up here. So Hillary is wondering, and it's a bit vague, so we'll leave it open-ended for you. What is the coolest piece of technology you see the U.S. military working on that you can actually talk about?
Oh, the caveat. Okay.
I mean, if you want to reveal state secrets on our open platform here, go for it. But we do not take any responsibility for the words or actions of our speakers. I'll make that clear before he answers.
Your name is Tim Horgan. You are the executive director. One of the coolest things that I really get excited about, there's going to be one piece of this that the government's doing, and I'll explain why I think this is really interesting. Obviously, quantum cryptography and quantum decryption are a huge security risk, right? Our adversaries have been collecting data off of the internet for a very long time. They have a tremendous amount of our secrets, but they're all locked in what are today unbreakable security codes. I mean, just a hash of the way it mixes up information that it can't be deciphered by modern day computers that we have today. In the road towards quantum decryption and quantum cryptography to both protect our data, but then to decrypt data that we might want from an adversary, is leading us to a really, really interesting point. And the interesting point is with quantum computing, there's a side of computer science that is so optimistic about where we can get with quantum computing, and quantum cryptography is like that first step. And as the military thinks about even quantum computing, we think about the ability to operate at such a decision speed with so much information that it's never ever been possible before to do. And the reason for that is very, very simply, inside of computer science today, it's a binary system. It's zeros and ones. Most people have heard some variation of this story. But basically what it means is you only have one outcome from whatever decision you're trying to make. You're either getting a 1 or you're getting a 0. What's interesting about quantum is you create these states where you have a lot of different outcomes that you can get. Maybe it's 1, maybe it's 0, it's definitely 1, it's definitely 0. Maybe it's more likely to be 1, maybe it's more likely to be 0. But all of these probabilistic outcomes become very, very interesting to what we're doing. Now this opens up a whole new world of the way that we're actually coding systems and the way we're working through some of the things that we're developing. So as I think about where the military is going just with quantum encryption and quantum cryptography to the point of quantum computing, we open up a whole new world of benefit, not just for the military, but for the world in general. And I like to think about it this way because the internet, that was a Department of Defense project. We have an internet because someone in the government who is working on a defense project said we should have an internet, or more specifically, we should have two computers talk to each other. And then Tim Berners-Lee came along, and the rest is history. But the idea of some of the things that we can do from this encryption, decryption risk to computing, which is a huge opportunity, and then blossom that out from defense into the larger world is a huge opportunity for us. And we can think about, all right, fine. Now you can really, really identify threats on the landscape. You can think more about weather, space travel, those types of things are all awesome. But imagine some of the things that we can do with decrypting biological cancers. All these things that we've struggled to understand in the brain, how a brain works. The simple things that, for me, it's sometimes very guilt-ridden to walk down the streets of Boston and see someone on the side of the road with a cup in his hand who's my age, who doesn't have anything, who's just looking for money. And there was one about a month and a half ago that I walked past, and I went to the ATM and got some money and walked back because the hat that he had on said, "I love my dad," on the side of the street, my age. That's how close we are separated from that to where I am or where you are. Folks with Down syndrome, it's one small mutation that changes everything. So imagine taking everything we're doing that's exciting, manifesting itself in defense, and looking how we can then use this for the future. And we've got a massive opportunity for humanity as a whole.
Okay, I'm going to do 2 final questions. The first one, we'll see how it goes. Can we get AI to the point where it will just fight itself in computers? Whoever wins, we call it a day and say that country won. Can we just get away from all the kinetic stuff, have them fight it out, similar to that Matthew Broderick War Games movie back in the 80s, I think it was. Can we just have them fight it out and call it a day after that? We
can. And then one of those algorithms or one of those models will come back and say, "No, the game was stolen." So I don't think so.
Yeah, they'll build their back doors.
That's right.
To win and
they'll
cheat.
have a way out.
Yeah. Okay. So the more realistic or hopefully optimistic question I have to end us here tonight is, what do you think the future brings? is this a good story we will be telling in 20, 30 years from now? Is this a bad story we'll be telling?
I think it all depends on us. I really, really think it depends on us. The decision that we make as a society and as a global society over the next decade, I think are going to have the most impactful measures of whether or not we're successful or not successful. And there's two parts to that that I think are important. One is one strategic war in space over space control can lead to something called a Kessler syndrome. And the Kessler syndrome is what says when you have enough debris inside of low Earth orbit or mid-Earth orbit that it's uncontrollable and it starts destroying other systems that then blow up and create more pieces and parts. Because 17,000 miles an hour, you only need 1 gram to create almost a grenade-like effect on something else. If that whole satellite system collapses, guess what? So does most of our communication systems. And once our communication systems failed, now we start fighting over how are we communicating. People start taking advantage of other countries. We could very easily devolve into a world war with that. I think that's number one. But number two is if we can keep war in check. And right now, this may be an unpopular opinion, but the war in Ukraine is in check. It's two countries, they're fighting. It isn't spilling out into a larger war in Europe. It's not spilling out into a larger war in Asia. If we think about the Taiwan Straits, we think about Chinese aggression towards Taiwan, if that happens, it's very likely to be a localized war in the South China Sea. It'll be hard for anyone to defeat China with how much firepower they have, how much capacity, and how close Taiwan is. That's a localized war. Now, whether it spreads to other nations, that's yet to be seen. But if it stays localized, we can survive those types of things, in my opinion. But if we lose control of our ability to govern ourselves on the planet, either because we've taken bad decisions in space or because we explode into a third world war, I think it's very easy for us to set the clock back. I think it's very, very easy. So if we as a global society can think about there are all these benefits, we're getting to a point where we are so intelligent ourselves that we've created these things that are almost more intelligent than we are, or at least have the capability to be more intelligent than we are, that can be our partners in what the new evolution of humanity and society will actually be. I think we've got an amazing opportunity that is going to be one of those things that keeps us from, when we think about the words of Carl Sagan, one of the reasons why we don't know anybody's out there is maybe a lot of them have already destroyed themselves. Maybe we don't destroy ourselves and we become the first society to be able to create the goodness in the universe that maybe we see, or maybe even the multiverse that we see. Maybe our future is really that long.
Well, please join me in thanking Tom for his time and his insights. We really appreciate it. I do. One of the things that I've been really leaning into these days is the idea that we may not always know what the next steps are. We may not always know what's going to solve these issues, but we know for certain that having conversations is a part of the solution. So thank you all for taking the time to be a part of this conversation. We hope this is not the end of the conversation for you. We hope that you go out, share this event. It's been recorded and is up on our website the moment we end. Go out and share that conversation. Go out and share this message that hopefully we get things right, because if there are enough voices out there talking about the importance of this and the other issues that we talk about, we have an opportunity to help push the global conversation forward. So thank you again for joining us. We look forward to our next event here in our office, our annual meeting on June 12th. We hope that you'll join us for that. And then for our Global Forum fundraiser with Secretary Pompeo on June 25th. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. Love them, hate them, indifferent to them. Come and ask your questions. Come and be part of that global conversation. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.